When my son's fiancée told me I wasn't the right fit for their dream wedding, I smiled, nodded, and made one phone call. By morning, their $50,000 deposit had vanished. But that was just the beginning of my lesson in respect. Some people need to learn the hard way that family isn't something you can replace with social status. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The first time I held David, he was so small his entire hand could wrap around my index finger. Sarah laughed at how scared I looked. This big construction worker afraid to break something so precious. "He's tougher than you think, Frank," she'd whispered, adjusting the blanket around our son. "He's got your stubborn streak." 27 years later, I was beginning to understand just how right she'd been about that stubborn streak. Only now it was working against everything I'd tried to teach him. I should have seen the warning signs earlier, but when you love someone the way I love David, you make excuses. You tell yourself that the changes you're seeing are just natural growth, maturity, the evolution of a young man finding his place in the world. You don't want to admit that the child you raised is slowly being reshaped by someone who sees his past as something to overcome rather than honor. The transformation started subtly. Small comments here and there, corrections to stories I'd tell about David's childhood, gentle suggestions that maybe I shouldn't mention certain details about our life when we were around certain people. At first, I thought it was Amanda's way of fitting into our family, trying to understand our dynamic, maybe feeling insecure about coming from such a different background. I was a fool to give her that much credit. David had met Amanda Richardson at his architecture firm's Christmas party 2 years earlier. She worked in marketing for some luxury real estate development company that specialized in exclusive communities for people with more money than sense. According to David, it had been love at first sight. Her blonde hair catching the light, her confident way of moving through the room like she owned every space she entered. "Dad, she's incredible," he'd gushed during our regular Sunday phone calls. "She's so sophisticated, so well-traveled. She speaks 3 languages and has a master's degree from Harvard. Can you believe someone like that would be interested in me?" Even through the phone, I could hear the insecurity in his voice. The same insecurity I'd spent his entire childhood trying to heal. The fear that somehow he wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't worthy of the best things life had to offer. "Son," I'd said, settling back in my recliner with my coffee, "someone like that should be grateful that someone like you is interested in her. You're kind, hardworking, honest, and you've got more integrity in your little finger than most people have in their whole body." But I could tell he wasn't really listening. He was already lost in the spell of someone who represented everything he thought he wanted to become. The first time David brought Amanda home, I'd spent the entire morning cleaning the house. Not because it was dirty. Sarah had raised me to keep things tidy, but because I wanted everything to be perfect for this woman who'd captured my son's heart. I'd even bought fresh flowers for the kitchen table, and made sure to hide the beer behind fancy sparkling water I'd picked up specially for the occasion. When they pulled into the driveway in Amanda's silver BMW, I watched through the window as she sat in the car for a long moment, looking up at our modest 2-story house. Not the kind of sprawling colonial or modern minimalist showcase she was probably used to, but the home where Sarah and I had raised our son with love and laughter. "It's quaint," she'd said when I welcomed them at the door, her smile bright and hollow. "Very authentic." I'd learned to hate that word over the following months. The way Amanda used it, authentic meant outdated, unfashionable, slightly embarrassing. Something you might find charming in a museum, but wouldn't want in your actual life. That first dinner had been a masterclass in polite condescension. Amanda had asked all the right questions about my work, complimented Sarah's cooking with just the right amount of enthusiasm, and shown appropriate interest in the family photos covering our mantelpiece. But I'd caught the way her eyes catalogued everything. The furniture from practical department stores rather than designer showrooms. The artwork Sarah had picked up at local craft fairs rather than galleries. The general sense that everything in our house had been chosen for comfort and meaning rather than status. "Your father has such interesting stories," Amanda had said to David, as I'd recounted finishing the new library before the grand opening. "So colorful." Colorful. Another word that sounded like a compliment but felt like an insult. But David had been glowing with happiness, so proud to show off this sophisticated woman who'd chosen him. And I'd wanted to approve. I'd wanted to love anyone who could put that kind of joy on my son's face. "She seems nice," Sarah had said later as we cleaned up dishes, but she'd said it in the same tone she used when commenting on weather that might turn bad. You don't like her. Sarah had dried a plate with unnecessary concentration. It's not that I don't like her. I just get the feeling she's interviewing us, like we're applying to be worthy of her attention. I'd laughed it off at the time, but as the months passed, that feeling of being evaluated never went away. Every conversation with Amanda felt like a test I didn't know I was taking. The changes in David started small. He began correcting his grammar when he talked, eliminating casual expressions and regional phrases that had been part of his speech since childhood. He started wearing different clothes, expensive brands that required overtime to afford, clothes that looked like uniforms for a life he was auditioning to join. I got promoted, he'd announced during one of our Sunday dinners, 6 months after Amanda had started coming around regularly. Junior associate to senior associate. Amanda says it's because I'm finally presenting myself as executive material. Amanda had smiled and squeezed his hand. David's really been working on his professional image. It's amazing what a difference the right appearance can make. The right appearance. As if the capabilities I'd watched him develop over 27 years weren't enough on their own. But the real changes were deeper. David stopped mentioning his mother's Italian heritage, the Sunday dinners with her extended family, the traditions that had shaped his understanding of love and loyalty. He stopped talking about the summers he'd spent working with my construction crew, learning the value of hard work and the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. Instead, he started emphasizing his academic achievements, his scholarships, the awards he'd won in college. All the things that proved he'd transcended his background rather than been shaped by it. Amanda's parents are coming for dinner next weekend, he'd announced one evening in late fall, about a year into their relationship. I was hoping we could make a good impression. I'd looked up from the sports section, noting the nervous energy in his voice. What kind of impression are you worried about, son? It's just, they're very successful people. Her father owns 3 country clubs in Connecticut, and her mother sits on the boards of several charities. They're used to a certain level of sophistication. Sophistication. Another word that had become code for not like us. And you're worried I'll embarrass you. No, Dad, that's not. I just want them to see that you're successful too, that you've built something important. But the way he'd said it made it clear that my kind of success, the construction company I'd built from nothing, the 43 men I employed, the buildings around town that bore my craftsmanship, wasn't the kind that would impress the country club crowd. That dinner with Amanda's parents had been a revelation. Richard and Catherine Richardson had arrived in a car that cost more than most people's houses, dressed like they were attending a board meeting. They'd greeted me with polite handshakes that acknowledged without warmth. "Frank," Richard had said, somehow managing to make my name sound diminished. "Amanda's told us so much about you. The construction business, very hands-on." Catherine had smiled with practiced graciousness. "And this is your home? How lived in it feels. So different from the sterile show places you see these days. Lived in. Code for shabby." Throughout dinner, they'd ask questions that sounded like interest, but felt like interrogation. What kind of projects did my company handle? How long had I been in business? Did I have plans for expansion? Each question was followed by subtle comparisons to their world, the developers they knew who'd really made something of themselves, the smart money opportunities in commercial real estate. David had tried to jump in, to highlight my achievements, but every story he told seemed to shrink under their need for approval. The way he presented my accomplishments made them sound like quaint local successes rather than the lifetime of hard work they actually represented. "Well," Catherine had said as they prepared to leave, "it's so important for young people to understand their roots." David's certainly grounded in his background, like it was quicksand he needed to escape from. After they'd left, Amanda had stayed behind for coffee. "I think that went really well," she'd said, settling into Sarah's favorite chair. "My parents were so impressed with how authentic your lifestyle is." There was that word again. They said it's refreshing to meet people who are so comfortable with simplicity. My mother especially appreciated how unpretentious everything was. David had beamed at what he took to be compliments, but I'd heard the real message. We were a curiosity to these people, worth observing in small doses, but not something you'd want to actually be part of. The engagement had been announced 3 months later, with a ring that must have cost David 6 months of overtime. Amanda had posted photos on every social media platform she could access. always mentioning her wonderful fiancé, but somehow never quite managing to mention his family background. "We're thinking destination wedding," she'd announced during the dinner where they'd shared their news. "Somewhere romantic and exclusive, maybe Italy or the French countryside. We want something that really captures the elegance we're looking for." Elegance. Another word that had become a weapon. "That sounds expensive," I'd said, watching David's face for signs of financial stress. "Well," Amanda had laughed, "you only get married once. It's worth investing in something truly memorable." Investing. As if love were a commodity that required market analysis. That night, David had called me separately. "Dad, about the wedding, I hate to ask, but Amanda has such a clear vision for what she wants, and I want to give her the wedding of her dreams. The kind of celebration that her family will be proud of. Her family, not our family. Not a celebration that honored both their backgrounds. But he was my only child, and I'd been saving for this moment since he was born. How much are we talking about? Maybe 50,000? 60 at the most. $60,000. More than Sarah and I had spent on our first house. More than most people made in a year. Consider it my gift to you both," I'd said, hearing his relief through the phone. Every father wants to give his son the wedding of his dreams. What I didn't know then was that Amanda had already decided those dreams didn't include me. The planning process had been an education in exclusion. Amanda had created group chats and email chains for everyone involved in wedding preparation, but somehow I was always left off the important conversations. When I'd ask David about details, he'd give me vague summaries that made it clear the real decisions were being made without my input. The guest list had been another exercise in subtle exclusion. Amanda's family would bring about 40 people. Parents, siblings, extended family, college friends, business associates, country club connections. David's side would be much smaller. Me, of course, and a few of his college friends who'd managed to maintain their friendships despite Amanda's influence. "What about your mom's family?" I'd asked David during one of our increasingly rare private conversations. "Uncle Tony and Aunt Maria? Your cousins?" David had shifted uncomfortably. "Amanda thinks it might be better to keep things streamlined. Avoid any language barriers or cultural confusion that might make people uncomfortable." Language barriers, cultural confusion. As if Sarah's family, American citizens for 3 generations, successful small business owners who'd welcomed David with open arms, were somehow foreign obstacles to Amanda's perfect day. "She's concerned about the mix," David had continued, not meeting my eyes. "Her family is very cosmopolitan. She wants to make sure everyone feels comfortable. Everyone except the people who'd actually raised him, apparently. The venue selection video call had been my first real glimpse of their true intentions. Amanda had arranged it like a business presentation, professional and calculated. "Now, about the guest accommodations," the coordinator had said in crisp, accented English. "We'll need to know about any special requirements, dietary restrictions, accessibility needs, that sort of thing." Amanda had glanced at me, then back at the screen. "Actually, we're keeping the wedding very curated, just immediate family and our closest friends. Very refined." Refined. Curated. The words had hit me like physical blows. "Dad's definitely coming," David had jumped in, but I'd caught the look that passed between them. A look that said they'd already discussed this, already identified my presence as a problem to be managed. "Of course," Amanda had smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. "Though we should probably discuss the dress code, make sure everyone understands the aesthetic we're going for." After the call had ended, I'd sat in my kitchen staring at the dark computer screen, finally understanding what I'd been witnessing for the past 18 months. This wasn't about Amanda learning to love David's family. This was about Amanda training David to be ashamed of us. The final confirmation had come 2 weeks later, during a conversation that would replay in my mind for months afterward. David had called on a Tuesday evening, his voice careful and rehearsed. "Dad, Amanda and I have been talking about the wedding, and we think it would be better if we kept things really simple. Just immediate family, very intimate." "I am immediate family, son." "Of course you are. It's just, Amanda's parents are bringing some business associates, people who are important to our future, and she's concerned about, well, she thinks it might be better if we keep the focus on building relationships that will help us professionally." Building relationships. Code for networking. My son's wedding had become a business opportunity, and I was bad for business. "David," I'd said, keeping my voice level, Are you telling me I'm not invited to your wedding? Silence. Long, horrible silence. It's not that you're not invited, Dad. It's just, maybe it would be better if you didn't participate in the ceremony itself. We could do something special just for you when we get back. Something more appropriate. Appropriate. The final insult, wrapped in consideration. I'd hung up that night knowing that the son I'd raised was disappearing, replaced by someone who saw his own father as an obstacle to overcome. But Amanda had made one crucial mistake in her campaign to erase me from David's story. She'd forgotten who was paying for the fairy tale she was trying to create. The lunch meeting had been Amanda's idea, neutral ground where she could make her final pitch. I'd arrived early, chosen a table with a good view, and waited for her to show her cards. She'd come prepared like a corporate presentation, leather portfolio, and practiced smile, sliding into the seat across from me with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. Frank, she'd begun, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about David's future. David's future. Not their future together, not our family's future. David's future, as if I weren't part of it. The thing is, this wedding represents something really important for David's career. The people who'll be there, the connections he'll make, the image we project as a couple. It's all going to impact the opportunities available to him going forward. She'd paused, probably waiting for me to nod along. And your presence there, she'd continued, it sends a certain message about who David is, what his priorities are, the kind of background he's coming from. What message would that be, Amanda? Her smile had flickered slightly. Well, you're a wonderful man, Frank. But you're just so blue-collar. The stories you tell, the way you present yourself, your friends, it's all very working class. And that's fine for you. But it's not the image David and I are trying to project. The image they were trying to project with my $50,000. You see, David's being considered for partnership track at his firm, she'd pressed on. The people making those decisions will be at our wedding. I need them to see him as one of them, as someone who belongs in their world, not as someone who's still connected to his past. Connected to his past, like I was a criminal record he needed to hide. So, what exactly are you proposing, Amanda? What if you just skip the ceremony? You could still be part of the celebration in other ways. Maybe we could do a small family dinner when we get back. Something more suited to your social circle. A small family dinner, for my social circle, like a consolation prize for the man who was bankrolling their fantasy. I'd let the silence stretch between us, watching her fidget with her engagement ring. The ring I'd helped David buy by co-signing a loan he couldn't qualify for on his own. And David agrees with this arrangement. For the first time, her composure had cracked slightly. David understands that sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the greater good. He loves you, Frank, but he also recognizes that this wedding is about our future, not his past. Our future. His past. Like 27 years of love and sacrifice were just outdated baggage he needed to leave behind. I'd reached for my wallet, pulled out enough cash to cover my lunch and a generous tip. Then I'd looked Amanda straight in the eye and smiled. You know what, Amanda? You're absolutely right. I don't belong at your wedding. Relief had flooded her face like sunrise after a long night. Oh, Frank, I'm so glad you understand. This doesn't change anything between us, you know. You'll always be David's father. Yes, I'd agreed, standing up from the table. I will always be David's father, and David will always be the son of a blue-collar construction worker who taught him that a man's word is his bond, that respect isn't something you buy, and that family stands together no matter what the social climbers say. I'd walked out of that restaurant knowing exactly what I was going to do next. Amanda thought she'd won, but she'd made the same mistake that had destroyed more powerful people than her. She'd forgotten that the man she was trying to push aside was the same man writing the checks for her perfect life. That afternoon, I drove straight to First National Bank, the same institution where I'd opened my first business account 32 years earlier with a deposit of $847. Every dollar I had after buying my first truck and a set of used tools. Patricia Hendricks had been my banker for the last 15 years, watching me build my company from a struggling one-man operation into something that employed nearly 50 people. Frank, she'd greeted me with the warm smile reserved for customers who'd never missed a payment. What brings you in today? How's David doing with the wedding plans? That question hit harder than I'd expected. Patricia had watched David grow up through our banking relationship. College tuition payments, graduation celebrations, the proud father stories I'd shared during our quarterly business reviews. "That's actually what I need to talk to you about," I'd said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I need to stop payment on a check." Patricia's expression had shifted from casual friendliness to professional concern. "What kind of check are we talking about?" I'd pulled the wedding venue contract from my jacket pocket, the document that had represented hope just hours earlier. Now it felt like evidence of my own foolishness. $50,000 deposit for David's wedding venue. She'd read through the contract carefully, her eyebrows rising as she absorbed the details. "This is quite an investment, Frank. Are you sure you want to stop payment?" "It's not an investment, Patricia. It's self-respect." She looked at me with the expression of someone who'd worked in banking long enough to recognize family drama. "What do you need me to do? I want that check to bounce the moment they try to process it. No courtesy calls, no grace periods, no second chances. Clean decline with insufficient funds notation. That's going to cause some problems for whoever's trying to process it." "Good. Maybe it's time some people learned that actions have consequences." Patricia had nodded slowly, her fingers already moving across her keyboard. "Consider it done. The stop payment will be effective immediately. Is there anything else?" "Yeah, I want you to transfer that $50,000 into a separate account, something I can access easily when I decide what to do with it. Any particular purpose in mind?" I'd smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. "Education. I'm going to teach some people a lesson about respect." The call had come 3 days later, at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. I'd been on a job site, reviewing blueprints for a new office complex with my foreman Tony Marcello, when my phone had started buzzing with David's ringtone. "Dad?" His voice had been tight with panic. "Dad, there's been some kind of mistake with the wedding deposit." I'd walked away from Tony and the crew, found a quiet spot behind our equipment trailer. "What kind of mistake?" The check bounced. "The venue coordinator called Amanda this morning, said the payment was declined due to insufficient funds. But that can't be right, can it? You said you had the money." "I do have the money, son." Silence stretched between us like a chasm. In the background, I could hear Amanda's voice rising in what sounded like hysteria. "I don't understand," David had said finally. "The check bounced because I canceled it." More silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, confused. You canceled it. Why would you do that?" "Because your fiancée made it crystal clear that I'm not welcome at your wedding. She explained that my presence would send the wrong message about who you are and what you value. So I figured, why should I pay for a party I'm not invited to?" I could hear him breathing, could practically see him pacing the way he'd done as a teenager when he was trying to work through a problem. "Look, can we talk about this? Maybe there's been a misunderstanding." The only misunderstanding was mine. I thought I was paying for my son's wedding. Turns out I was funding Amanda's social climbing expedition. That's not fair. You want to know what's not fair, David? Working 16-hour days for 5 years after your mother died so you wouldn't have to transfer to a cheaper school. Taking out a second mortgage on the house to pay for your graduate school applications. Eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch so I could afford to send you spending money in college. That's what's not fair. 27 years of sacrifice so you could have every opportunity I never had, only to discover that you're ashamed of the man who gave you those opportunities. The line had gone quiet, except for the sound of construction equipment in the background. Finally, David had spoken, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to decide what kind of man you are. Are you someone who stands by the people who love him, or are you someone who throws away family for social status? It's not that simple." "Yeah, son, it really is that simple." I'd ended the call and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the job site where men who respected me were building something that would last for generations. These were people who understood that a man's worth wasn't measured by his zip code or his accent, but by character revealed through actions. The next few days had been fascinating to watch unfold. Amanda's social media presence, which had been a constant stream of wedding planning updates, had gone completely silent. David had called me 17 times in the first week alone, each conversation following the same pattern. Apologies that didn't address the real issue, explanations that made everything worse, and increasingly desperate attempts to get me to restore their funding without actually acknowledging why I'd withdrawn it. "Dad, The venue says they can hold our date if we get the deposit to them by Friday, he'd pleaded during one call. Amanda's parents might be able to help, but it would mean scaling back everything. Sounds like you have a decision to make. Come on, Dad. You know we can't afford this level of celebration without your help. Then maybe you should have thought about that before deciding I wasn't good enough to attend. But I could tell the conversations were planting seeds. For the first time since this mess started, David was beginning to understand that his choices had consequences beyond his own immediate desires. The breakthrough came during week 3 of what Amanda had started calling the financial crisis. I'd been at home, enjoying a quiet Saturday morning with coffee and the newspaper, when I'd heard a car in my driveway. Through the window, I'd watched David get out of his Honda Civic, not Amanda's BMW, which told me everything I needed to know about the current power dynamic in their relationship. When I'd opened the door, he'd looked like the boy I remembered from his teenage years, uncertain, vulnerable, looking for guidance. "Hi, Dad. David, coffee?" "Yeah, that would be good." I'd made it the way I'd taught him when he was 14, strong and black. We'd sat at the kitchen table where he'd done homework every night through high school. "Amanda and I had a fight," he'd said without preamble. I'd waited, giving him space to work through whatever he needed to say. When the wedding got canceled, when her parents found out why, she said things. About you, about our family, about the life you built for us. He'd run his hands through his hair. "Dad, she called you an embarrassing relic who was holding me back from my potential." The words had hit like physical blows, but I'd kept my expression neutral. "And what did you say?" I didn't know what to say. Part of me was angry at her for talking about you like that. But part of me was angry at you for putting me in this position, for making me choose. And which part won? David had looked down at his hands. The wrong part. I defended her. I told her that your reaction was just outdated thinking, that you couldn't understand the complexities of our situation. The admission hung between us like smoke from a fire. "But then her father made some calls," David had continued. "Found out exactly how much you're worth, how successful your business really is. Suddenly Amanda was very interested in rebuilding the relationship." I'd set down my coffee cup. "So, now that she knows I'm not just some blue-collar nobody, I'm worth tolerating." "It's not like that." "It's exactly like that, son. When she thought I was just some working-class guy who got lucky, I was an embarrassment. Now that she knows I'm a working-class guy who built something significant, I'm a resource to be managed." David had nodded miserably. "I know how it looks. I know what she's doing. But Dad, I love her, and I thought maybe if she got to know you better—" "David," I'd interrupted gently, "a woman who needs to see my tax returns to respect me isn't a woman who's ever going to understand what kind of man I am." We'd sat in silence, both grappling with truths that were too painful to ignore. "So what happens now?" David had asked finally. "Now you make a choice. You can marry a woman who sees your father as a problem to be solved, or you can find someone who sees him as a blessing to be honored." David had left that day without making commitments, but I could see the wheels turning. For the first time in months, he was asking himself the right questions. The next phase of Amanda's campaign had been predictably transparent. She'd started calling me directly, her voice honey-sweet with false intimacy. "Frank, I've been thinking so much about our conversation, and I realize I didn't express myself well. I was nervous about impressing my parents, and I think I let that anxiety make me say things I didn't really mean." "What things were those, Amanda?" "Well, all that talk about image and professional concerns. The truth is, I think it would be wonderful to have you at our wedding. David's told me so many stories about what an amazing father you've been, the man who raised such an incredible son. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been an embarrassing relic. Now I was an amazing father. The only thing that had changed was her understanding of my net worth. But the real revelation came 2 weeks later, in a way I never could have orchestrated. David had arrived at my house looking shell-shocked, like someone had hit him with devastating news. "Dad, I need to tell you something. Something I heard today." An hour later, he was sitting in my kitchen, looking like he'd aged 5 years in a single morning. "I went to surprise Amanda for lunch," he'd begun, staring at hands that seemed to belong to someone else. Her office door was closed, but I could hear her voice. She was on the phone talking about me. I'd waited, recognizing the signs of a man who needed to work through something devastating at his own pace. She was explaining to her college friend why the wedding got postponed, why things have been so complicated. David had looked up at me then, his eyes red-rimmed and devastated. "Dad, she said she never loved me, called me a project she'd been working on, said dating me was like adopting a rescue dog, rewarding if you could train out the undesirable behaviors." The words had hit harder than physical blows. I'd suspected Amanda saw David as a fixer-upper, but hearing it described so clinically was worse than I'd imagined. She said at first she thought it would be easy, that you'd be grateful to be included in her family's social circle, that you'd understand your place and stay in it. She underestimated the ego of working-class men and their inability to recognize their betters. My hands had clenched into fists, but I'd forced myself to stay calm. David needed support, not more anger. She told her friend she'd been trying to figure out how to manage the father situation for months, that her biggest mistake was not researching your actual net worth before she started the relationship, because if she'd known how much money you had, she would have handled you completely differently. The plan had been even more calculated than I'd realized. Amanda hadn't just been excluding me from their wedding, she'd been positioning herself to control their entire future. But the worst part, David had continued, was when her friend asked if she actually cared about me at all. I dreaded the answer. She said I was pleasant enough and would serve her purposes adequately, that having a husband with a romantic working-class backstory would make her interesting at dinner parties, as long as she could keep the reality properly contained. Pleasant enough, serve her purposes. This was how the woman David planned to marry really saw him. "I'm sorry," David had said, looking at me with eyes that had finally seen clearly. "I'm sorry I let her convince me you were the problem. I'm sorry I chose someone who saw my family as an obstacle instead of a blessing. I'd pulled my son into the kind of embrace we hadn't shared since he was a teenager, feeling his shoulders shake as 27 years of love and values finally reasserted themselves. It's okay, son. You recognized it before it was too late. What do I do now? You learn from it. You remember what it felt like to almost lose yourself trying to become someone else, and you make sure it never happens again." The confrontation with Amanda that evening had been inevitable. David had gone to her apartment knowing exactly what he'd find. She'd known the moment he walked in that he'd heard the phone call, hadn't even tried to deny it. "So now you know," she'd said with cold calculation. Amanda's mask had finally come completely off. She'd said everything she'd told her friend was true, that she'd been doing David a favor by trying to elevate him beyond his natural social level. When David had told her the engagement was over, she'd laughed. Said he'd never find anyone as good as her, that he'd be crawling back within 6 months begging her to take him back. Said without her guidance, he'd revert to type and end up exactly like me. Exactly like me. She'd meant it as the ultimate insult, but David had finally understood it was the highest compliment. Then she'd threatened his career, said her father had connections throughout the architectural community, that she could make sure he never worked for any firm that mattered. "I told her," David had said later, "that if being exactly like my father was the worst thing that could happen to me, I was looking forward to it, that I'd rather spend my life building things with my hands and treating people with respect than climbing social ladders by stepping on people who loved me." The months that followed were about rebuilding, not just our relationship, but David's relationship with himself. Amanda's influence had been more pervasive than either of us had realized, affecting everything from his career goals to his basic sense of self-worth. "I don't even know who I was becoming," he'd confessed during one of our resumed Sunday dinners. "I was so focused on being the man she wanted that I forgot what kind of man I actually was." "And what kind of man are you?" "I'm Frank Castellano's son. Someone who believes that character matters more than connections, that hard work is more valuable than inherited privilege, and that family means showing up for the people you love, even when it's inconvenient." We worked together to repair the damage, reconnecting with his mother's family, rebuilding friendships that had been neglected, rediscovering interests and values that had been suppressed. It was like watching someone recover from a long illness, gradually returning to health and strength. The new beginning came 6 months later in the most unexpected way. David had been working late at his firm, trying to catch up on a project delayed by the chaos of his broken engagement, when the building's cleaning crew had arrived. Usually he'd pack up and leave, but that night he'd been too focused to pay attention. "Excuse me," a voice had said behind him. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to empty your trash."
He'd looked up to find a woman about his age, wearing the uniform of the building's cleaning service, smiling apologetically for the interruption. She'd had kind eyes, and something about her presence had made him feel immediately comfortable. "No problem," he'd said. "I should probably head home anyway." "Long day?" "Long life," he'd replied, then immediately felt embarrassed by the overshare. "Sometimes strangers are the best listeners," she'd said, continuing her work efficiently. "They don't have any preconceived notions about who you're supposed to be." That conversation had led to others, brief exchanges during her cleaning rounds that gradually developed into something deeper. Her name was Sarah. Yes, the same name as David's mother, and she was working her way through nursing school, supporting herself and her younger sister while pursuing a degree that would let her help people. "She's amazing, Dad," David had told me when he'd finally worked up the courage to introduce us. "She's smart and funny and kind, and she doesn't care about any of the superficial stuff that used to seem so important. She just sees people for who they really are." Sarah Chen had grown up in a family of immigrants, first-generation Americans, who understood the value of hard work and education. Her parents owned a small restaurant in Chinatown, the kind of family business that required everyone to pitch in and work together to succeed. "When I told her about you," David had continued, "about the business you built and the sacrifices you made for my education, her first reaction was that she couldn't wait to meet you. She said any man who could raise someone as good as me must be pretty special himself." That first dinner with Sarah had been everything the meals with Amanda never were. Warm, genuine, filled with laughter and comfortable conversation between people who genuinely liked each other. She'd asked about my work with real interest, shared stories about her family with obvious love and pride, and treated David with the kind of respect and affection that made it clear she saw him as a blessing, not a project. "Mr. Castellano," she'd said as we'd sat on my back porch after dinner watching the sunset, "David's told me so much about what an incredible father you've been. I hope you know how proud he is to be your son." "He's a good man," I'd replied. "Gets his best qualities from his mother. From what I've heard about her, you two raised him exactly right. Family first, character above all else, and never forget where you came from. Those are good values to live by." "They're the values I want to teach my children someday," she'd said, then blushed as if she'd revealed more than she'd intended. But David had just smiled and taken her hand, and I'd seen in his eyes the same look that had been in mine the first time I'd held his mother. The proposal had happened 8 months later, during a quiet Sunday dinner at my house. No fancy restaurant, no elaborate production. Just David getting down on one knee in my living room and asking Sarah to be his wife with his grandmother's ring. "Sarah," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion, "I spent too many years trying to be someone I wasn't, trying to fit into a world that didn't really want me. You helped me remember who I really am and why that's someone worth being. Will you marry me? Will you help me build the kind of life my parents would be proud of?" She'd said yes through tears, and I'd known that this time David had chosen correctly. The wedding had been everything Amanda's celebration never could have been. Authentic, meaningful, filled with people who genuinely loved the couple and wanted to celebrate their happiness. We'd held it in my backyard, under the old oak tree that Sarah had planted when David was 5, with folding chairs borrowed from our church and flowers from Sarah's mother's garden. Sarah had worn her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit perfectly, and updated with small touches that honored both her heritage and her new family. David had worn the suit I'd been married in, tailored to fit him, and pressed with the kind of care that comes from understanding the significance of the moment. The guest list had included about 50 people, family, real friends, the construction crew who'd watched David grow up, Sarah's nursing school classmates, neighbors who'd been part of our lives for decades. No business connections, no social climbing, no networking opportunities. Just people who cared about David and Sarah and wanted to witness their commitment to each other. During the ceremony, David's vows had brought tears to everyone's eyes. "Sarah," he'd said, his voice carrying clearly across the backyard, "you helped me find my way back to the man my father raised me to be. You showed me that love doesn't ask you to change everything about yourself. It celebrates who you already are and helps you become the best version of that person. I promise to honor your family the way you've honored mine, to support your dreams the way you've supported my healing, and to never let anyone make me forget that the greatest privilege in my life is being loved by you." Sarah's vows had been equally moving, but it was her words about family that had brought me to tears. "David, when I met you, I thought I was just getting a wonderful husband, but I was also getting a father-in-law who shows every day what it means to love unconditionally
to sacrifice without complaint, and to build something meaningful with your own hands. Frank, thank you for raising the man I love and for welcoming me into a family that understands what really matters. The reception had been potluck style. Everyone had brought a dish that meant something to them, creating a feast that represented our community rather than our budget. There had been dancing to music from an old boombox, toasts with champagne that came from bottles instead of cases, and the kind of joy that can't be purchased or manufactured. Late in the evening, as we'd been cleaning up paper plates and folding chairs, David had found me sitting on the back steps, watching the last of the guests say their goodbyes. "Dad," he'd said, settling down beside me, "I need to say something." "What's that, son?" "Thank you. For not giving up on me when I gave up on myself. For not letting me make the biggest mistake of my life without a fight. For teaching me that real love doesn't come with conditions or requirements or social expectations. You don't need to thank me for loving you, David. That's not something a father does for recognition. Maybe not, but I need you to know that I understand now what you were trying to protect me from. And I need you to know that I'm proud to be Frank Castellano's son, proud to come from the kind of family that sticks together no matter what, and proud to have learned what real character looks like by watching you live it every day. We'd sat there in comfortable silence, watching Sarah help her mother pack up leftover food, listening to the sounds of a celebration that had been built on love instead of ambition. "You know what the best part of today was?" David had asked finally. "What's that?" "Looking around and seeing that everyone here actually wanted to be here. No one was performing or networking or trying to impress anyone else. Everyone was just happy for us. That's what a real celebration looks like, son. When the people who matter most want to be there to witness your joy." 6 months later, Sarah and David had bought a house 3 blocks away from mine, not because they needed my help, but because they wanted to be part of the same community that had shaped David's understanding of what family meant. Sarah had graduated nursing school and found a position at the Children's Hospital, work that fulfilled her desire to help people while building a career she could be proud of. Then came the news that completed the circle. "We've been talking," Sarah had said during one of our Sunday dinners, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, "about names for the baby." I'd nearly choked on my coffee. "Baby?" David had grinned, the same expression he'd worn as a boy when he'd brought me a perfect report card. "Sarah's pregnant, Dad. You're going to be a grandfather. We were hoping," Sarah had continued, "that if it's a girl, we could name her Sarah, after David's mother, and if it's a boy—" "Frank," David had finished. "We want to name him Frank, after his grandfather, who taught his father what it really means to be a man." I'd sat there in my kitchen, surrounded by the 2 people who meant more to me than anything else in the world, thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The pain of watching David lose himself, the heartbreak of being excluded from his life, the satisfaction of seeing him find his way back to his true self, and now the joy of knowing that the values Sarah and I had worked so hard to instill would be passed on to another generation. Amanda Richardson had been wrong about almost everything, but she'd been right about one thing. That wedding had indeed set the tone for David and Sarah's future together, just not in the way she'd intended. Their future was built on love that didn't require anyone to change who they fundamentally were. It was built on respect for family and community, and the understanding that success meant more than just accumulating wealth or status. It was built on the recognition that the best things in life, love, loyalty, integrity, the satisfaction of honest work, couldn't be bought or borrowed or faked. 3 years later, I was holding my grandson Frank Jr. in the same kitchen where I'd once made the phone call that changed everything, watching him wrap his tiny fingers around mine the same way his father had 27 years earlier. "He's got your stubborn streak," Sarah laughed from her chair, exhausted but radiant. "Look how tight he's holding on." The same words his grandmother had spoken in a hospital room decades ago, but this time they carried the weight of victory rather than hope. David entered carrying coffee, wearing the expression of a man who'd learned the difference between success and worth. "Dad, something interesting happened yesterday." "What's that, son?" Amanda called. The name fell into our peaceful morning like a stone into still water. I hadn't heard it spoken in our house since the day David had walked away from her 3 years earlier. "She's getting married," David continued. "Some investment banker from her father's country club. She wanted to apologize for how things ended. And what did you tell her? David smiled. I thanked her. Thanked her. For showing me exactly what I didn't want in a partner. For teaching me to recognize real love when I found it. For proving that the greatest mistake I could make was trying to become someone other than Frank Castellano's son. He'd settled into his chair with easy comfort. She said she'd been watching my career, that I'd done well for myself despite choosing family over opportunity. And how did you respond? I told her she still didn't understand the difference. I didn't choose family over opportunity. I chose family as my opportunity. The opportunity to build something real, something lasting, something worth passing down. Sarah smiled and kissed baby Frank's head. Your daddy's pretty smart for someone who allegedly wasted his potential. There's something else, David said, his voice taking on the careful tone he'd used as a child when he had important news. Sarah and I have been talking about expanding the business. What business? Yours, Dad. Castellano Construction has a reputation for quality that goes back 3 decades. We want to help it grow. Sarah had been taking business classes alongside her nursing degree. I want to handle the administrative side, contracts, scheduling, client relations, free you up to focus on what you love most. And I want to bring the architectural perspective, David added. Help us move into larger projects, maybe some commercial development, but keeping the same values, the same commitment to craftsmanship. Castellano and Associates, Sarah suggested, 3 generations working together. I felt something shift in my chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. This wasn't about retirement or succession. This was about legacy, about building something that would outlast any of us individually. Later that day, I walked through my house, thinking about the strange turns life could take. 3 years ago, I'd been a father watching his son disappear into someone else's definition of success. I'd been excluded from what should have been one of the happiest moments of my life, treated like an embarrassment by people who couldn't recognize worth when it stared them in the face. Now I was a grandfather holding the promise of another generation, watching my son build exactly the kind of life I'd always hoped he'd choose. He'd found a woman who saw his background as strength rather than limitation, who understood that character was more valuable than connections. The $50,000 I'd refused to spend on Amanda's fairy tale had instead become the foundation for something real. David and Sarah's home, baby Frank's college fund, the expansion of a family business that would carry our name and values into the future. But the real investment had been in David's education, the painful but necessary lesson that love doesn't require you to change who you are, that the right person will celebrate your history rather than ask you to overcome it, that family stands together, especially when standing together is difficult. Amanda Richardson had been the most expensive teacher my son ever had, but also the most valuable. She'd shown him exactly what he didn't want, which had prepared him to recognize exactly what he did want when Sarah walked into his life. As I sat on my back porch that evening with a glass of whiskey, I thought about the phone call I'd made 3 years earlier to cancel that check. It had seemed like an ending at the time, potentially the end of my relationship with David if he'd chosen differently. Instead, it had been a beginning. The beginning of David's return to himself. The beginning of a love story worth celebrating. The beginning of a legacy built on authentic values rather than artificial status. Sometimes the most important gift you can give someone is the opportunity to choose, really choose, between what's easy and what's right, between what's convenient and what's honorable, between what the world tells them they should want and what their heart knows they need. David had made his choice, and watching him now, successful in his career, happy in his marriage, proud of his heritage, excited about his future, I knew he'd chosen correctly. The boy who'd once held my finger so tightly had grown into a man who held on to what mattered, and what mattered most wasn't money or status or social acceptance. What mattered was love that didn't come with conditions, respect that didn't require performance, and family that stood together no matter what storms might come. Amanda had tried to buy her way into our family with charm and promises and social connections. But family isn't something you can purchase or manipulate or redesign to fit your preferences. Family is something you choose, something you protect, something you build day by day through countless small acts of love and sacrifice and presence. And sometimes, when that family is threatened by people who don't understand its value, you make a phone call to cancel a check and remind everyone involved what really matters. The lesson had been expensive for Amanda and painful for David, but it had been priceless for all of us. If you enjoyed this story about standing up for family values and the price of choosing authenticity over acceptance, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between family and social expectations? What would you have done in Frank's situation? Click the video on the left to hear another powerful story about a father's love and the lengths will go to protect what matters most. Remember, the best inheritance isn't money, it's values that last for generations.